Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Kilayim, Chapter 5, Halacha 1. This is part 3 of this year. In the Art Scroll, we're on 47a1. This is about chaotically planted vineyards. Now, I wanted to give this its own treatment because of the nuance here, and the background logic of what's going on here is so critical to understand why any of this matters at all. Why do we want rationally planted vines and vineyards? In the next halacha that's going to be coming up, we're going to be dealing with the minimum measure for how close vines have to be to one another. That's going to be 4 amos. So we were learning that you have 4 amos setback between other species, fine. But between one vine and another, both grapevines, we are going to be at 4 amos. Why are we organizing it so that there's a rationality to having rows and that the rows are all going to match up, not only north and south, but left and right as well? The rows have to match up or it's not going to be considered part of a vineyard. It's going to be something else. Now, why do we care about that? Why do we care about having things in straight rows? Because if you start shifting things, then what will happen is you start eating up the nutrition of your land. And, you have a certain amount of land and you can only fit a certain number of vines on there at separations of 4 amos, which is going to be the maximum yield you can do. Everything that's going to be smaller than 4 amos is going to be regarded as like firewood. It's not going to, the roots are not going to develop correctly. The plant is going to be undersized. Why? Because you're having overlap between this root system and that root system. And we covered that in Masechet Shvius in chapter 1 with orchards. The same concept comes up in orchards where we want to maximize the number of trees that we can do for the nutrition of the land as well as for the space of the land. And if we are laying things out in a chaotic manner, your yield goes down. And if you're in a time where you have to always worry about calorie scarcity and things like that, you need to make sure that you're really doing full optimization here so that you get the maximum output. It's not like enough to just be like a casual gardener or something like that. We're dealing with a time where there's food scarcity and you need to get maximum utilization out of the land and fully spaced correctly so that you get the highest amount of yield for the land, the nutrition in the land, and the grapes themselves. So the downfall of planting chaotically is your yield goes down, and you could have utilized it in a way that was more rational. You could have done it in a more optimal way. Instead, you are basically leaving calories or grapes or whatever on the table, so to speak. And this is going to be true with any kind of field. I tell you a story that there was in China during the Cultural Revolution. There were these issues in China where the farmers were trying to report back to Mao Zedong's government about trying to up the yield and trying to get more out and trying to look like they were being innovative. And what did they do? What were the farmers doing and the government recommending the farmers to do was to take all of the seeds and pack it into very, very tight areas and to get more seeds per area to try to grow more stuff. And what they didn't understand is that you're eating up nutrition, and this is not a rational way to do it. Plants need to have spacing. Plants need to have arrangements of rows. Plants need to have boundaries where they're not going into another plant's area. And part of the downfall of planting chaotically is your yield collapses. And that's what happened in China in the Cultural Revolution. The yield collapsed. And a lot of pressure was put onto the farmers to try new things that were not necessarily arranged by farmers. It was arranged by some bureaucrat somewhere, and something that some guy never actually, who was a farmer, would seem logically that it would be working. Over here, we have the same sorts of things. What happens if you're having trunks that are out of alignment? You're going to have one issue that is going to be with a lower amount of yield for the land. The other case that you're going to have is that you might end up, because we have setbacks, that you might end up where one part that's out of alignment counts as its own vines, and you can plant foreign species close to that, but the main vineyard has a much, much bigger setback. And so while it looks like over here that you're getting a leniency, that, oh, I can plant very close foreign seed next to this, in the bigger picture, you might be disqualifying, vines in your vineyard, that you really have many, many more vines in your vineyard than you do a couple of vines that are out of alignment, and that you're getting a leniency on a couple of these vines. So you got to look at the big picture. So, in one case, you might be disqualifying, and that's what the Bryces are going to be coming up with later, that you're disqualifying, the bigger part of your vineyard while getting a leniency on a smaller part of, a few collections of vines. And it looks like, hey, if you're only looking at these collection of vines over here, looks like you're a big winner. And in fact, you've ended up disqualifying most of your product. And the other case is that, well, anyway, when you measure up this field that's planted rationally and this field that's planted chaotically, well, this one that's organized rationally to maximize nutrition in the ground and space is going to produce far more than the one is sort of haphazardly done. So the Mishnah teaches regarding a vineyard that was planted chaotically that if there are 5 vines within it that can be aligned facing 2 versus 3, it's a vineyard. That's Bet Hillel's vineyard. Now, the Brisa is going to explain how we're going to judge whether vines are aligned. And in determining Kilayim issues like with disqualification, normally we're going to look at the midpoint of a vine. We're going to say, oh, okay, the center point of the trunk of this vine is over here, and I'm going to do it like that. But there's a leniency that comes up in here where we're going to be using a string. We're going to be drawing across a string, and it depends on where it's going to be on the outer side of the trunk. So either way, there's 2 opinions on this. Either way, it's going to be a slight leniency versus when we're calculating other parts of Kilayim for disqualification. And I just want to point that out. So how do we judge whether vines are going to be lined up or not? And it says if the trunks of the vines are aligned, but the branches are not aligned, it is nevertheless a vineyard. Now, let's say you have the trunks, and these vines can be arranged in straight rows. And again, we have 3 and 2. And it's saying that the trunks of one row are going to be aligned with the corresponding trunks of the adjacent row, so that they're going to form straight columns, and so that you're having 2 facing 2. And that is going to basically make a square or a rectangle. And then you have your tail. So that's the minimum measure. And what this is trying to teach is that the vines have to be mirroring each other in these 2 rows. That you have to look at it in terms of lining up, say, north and south, but also east and west. And that's something that people can miss. In other words, if the vines are not mirroring each other, but a little bit, maybe, the 2 vines are in between the 3 vines, well, that's going to be another issue. And that's what we're going to be covering. So in order to have rational vines in vineyards and things that are going to count, they have to mirror each other, and they have to form rows that are lined up corresponding to these trunks, and it's going to form these straight columns and these straight rows, and they have to make squares and rectangles. So then what about the branches? Well, if you have branches of the various vines growing in different directions, that's not going to disqualify the vineyard. We're caring about the trunks. Where are the trunks lined up? And that's what it's trying to teach us. It continues. The Mishnah, the Gemara, the Brisa continues and says, if, however, the branches are aligned but the trunks are not aligned, it is not a vineyard. And the Pnei Moshe is saying the trunk is the main part of the vine, and basically the entire vine is considered to be located at this center point of the trunk. And we're finding that regarding most of the laws on trees, the status of the tree is going to be determined by the position of the trunk. It's not determined by the position of the branches. So the alignment of the vines is also going to be determined by where the trunk is. And so if the branches are lined up but the trunks are not, then it is not a halachic vineyard. Thin and not lined up, and then they subsequently thickened, and now they are presently lined up, it is deemed to be a vineyard. So the case over here is that the vines were not lined up when they were planted. And halachically, did that make a vineyard? No, they're not lined up. But now that these started to grow, the trunks thickened up, and now these do form straight lines in columns and also rows, well, that is now going to turn on as a vineyard. So that's important information to know. And, what we're seeing here from the Marafulda is that if the vines were thin and not aligned, but as they grew thick, they did align, it's going to be a vineyard. And according to that text, the vines are deemed to be a vineyard even before they thicken, as long as they're anticipated that they will thicken and become aligned. And that's an important nuance there that that we're looking at it and saying, okay, I have kavanah that this is going to be, I planted it this way, and I know that it's going to thicken in and line up, and okay, maybe this one's a little bit out right now, but it will thicken and it will be in rows. Those are going to count. Now, the Brisa is going to continue, and it's going to say what we've been wondering all along. How do you know whether the trunks are lined? How do you know this? How do you know that you have straight columns and straight rows that are going north and south and left and right? And so it says that he brings a string and he runs it alongside the vines. And the Gemara says there's a teacher, a Brisa, who teaches the text as concluding that one stretches out a string from the inside of the row of the vines, and there's another teacher, Brisa, who teaches that the text is going to be where they're going to stretch out this string from the outside of the row of the vines. By the way, it doesn't even mean that they have to contradict. They could be talking about different nuances within the same law. But really what this is saying is that each row of the vineyard may contain vines that deviate slightly from the middle course of the row, and some can extend toward the inside of the vineyard and some toward the outside. And how do you determine that? It's going to be determined by, if these vines are still going to be reckoned as belonging to the same row, and a string is going to be stretched to measure how far the outward vines deviated from the innermost vines. And according to the first version of this brisa, the string is stretched along the inner edge of the inner vines. And according to the second version, it is stretched along the outer edge of the inner vines of the row. So the Gemara will explain how much deviation is allowed in order for the vines to still be considered part of a row. And the Gemara goes back to Rabbi Yonah, and Rabbi Yonah says, according to the one who says that the string is stretched from the inside of the row, the vines are deemed aligned as long as the protruding vines are within a tefach of the string. So the Marafulda says about this that as long as the inner edge of the outer vines, the ones that are off a little bit, are within a tefach of the inner edges, so a tefach again is going to be a handbreadth, then this is going to be where it's deemed to be part of the row. In other words, the string is going to run along the inward part of the vine, and as long as the maximum deviation from these outer vines is only going to be a tefach from the rest of the row, it's still going to count as part of the vineyard. And so, you're not going to end up with a halachically, chaotically planted vineyard. And then there's the other Baraisa, the other opinion of the Baraisa, and Rabbi Yo is going to explain it like this. And it says, according to the one who says that the string is stretched from the outside of the row, the string must touch the protruding vines in order to be deemed aligned. Now, the Marafulda is going to say about Rabbi Yonah's explanation of this second Baraisa that the string is going to be stretched alongside the outer edge of the inner vine, and basically in this row it must touch the inner edge of these outside vines. And according to this reading, the Baraisa does not establish a fixed measure of latitude per row. Rather, if the vines are positioned such that they all touch the same string, meaning that at least part of the outer vine is going to line up with part of the inner vine, they're going to belong to the same row. Now, there's an explanation by the Chazan Ish about how it's possible that the two versions are not going to be arguing, but in fact, really going to be like different parts of the same law, different explanations of the same law. And the Chazan Ish is going to explain that as long as a part of each protruding vine, in other words, the one that's out of alignment, is lined up with part of the inner vine, they're deemed to be lined up. So, in as much as a trunk is generally going to be a tefach wide, it's going to emerge that the vines for grapevines, where you're going to make your wine out of, generally are around a tefach thick for an older vine. So basically, when the string is stretched alongside the inner side of the innermost vine, and the protruding vines that are questionable are going to be within a tefach of the string, then part of that trunk will still be lined up with part of the inner vine. And on the second part of the brisa, when the string is stretched on the outer side of the innermost vines, then the string does not touch the protruding vines, then in that case it would be evident that no part of the protruding vine is lined up with the inner vine. So really, how do you reconcile these two brises? They're really measuring from different parts of the outer vine and also the vine that is the main part of your vineyard. So one is going to be measuring from the outer part of the vine, and one is going to be measuring from the inner part, and that's how you're going to determine whether because a farmer can measure one of two ways. Either they can measure from the outer part of the main part of the vines, or they can measure from the inner part of the vines that are deviated. And so the question is, how are they going to be lined up? Are they going to be touching? Are they going to be a tefach apart? Where are you measuring from? But this is really not that much different. And you're basically, either way you're going to be doing it, basically ending up with the same answer. And really, you can see that very, very large deviations are going to be disqualified. And that's really what we care about. In other words, we really care that, that our vineyard is going to be rationally done so that, your rows are going to be oriented correctly. Now, why does that matter, right? Let's say you have a 2-row vineyard and it's 10 rows, 10 vines, so it's just 5 and 5. And let's say the second set of 5 has some of the vines are going to be out of alignment, so that you'd say, oh well, it's 3 and 2, and that's Bet Hillel, but not so fast, right? We learned that the 3 and 2 have to make up a square and then have a tail. And so if you have 5 vines and some of them are outside of this row, and you have like 3 and 2, and the 2 are just out there, and it doesn't make a rational square with these 3 vines mirroring these 2, that's not really a vineyard. And all of a sudden, why? Why is that not a vineyard? Because you only have 5 vines in a row. And 5 vines in a row is Bet Shammai's vineyard. And we know that that's not a vineyard. And we know that, if you have just some individually planted vines, well, that's going to be counted as individually planted vines. So here you had a case where you had 10 vines planted in 2 rows. The second row is chaotically done so that the first row and the second row don't make a vineyard, don't connect. And then the chaotically planted vines also don't connect. So what do you end up with? You just ended up with a mess. Now, the Gemara is going to get into a related brisa, and it's going to say that if the vines of the outer row are not aligned with the vine trunks of the vine's other rows, then it is not considered a continuation of the vineyard. And the Gemara says that we give the unaligned row the work area of 6 tefachim, in which it's going to be forbidden to plant foreign seed, and one may plant the remainder, in other words, the area beyond 6 tefachim, although it is still within the 4 amos of the outer row. So what is this dealing with over here? So again, we want to have our rationally planted vineyards. And what is this teaching? This is teaching that, look, your vines, they have to go north and south, okay, in rows. And they have to make columns. But they also have to go east and west. And they have to line up with one another going, in all directions, whether it's up and down or left and right. And so you might have thought that, well, wait a second, I have, let's say I have 15 vines, and, I have 10 vines here, and they're in a row, and they're mirror images, and they mirror each other left and right, and they mirror each other up and down. And now I have these 5 vines over here, and they're sort of in the middle between the other 10 vines. And now what happens, right? And so what is this showing, right? This is showing that really all 15 vines are supposed to be in a row left and right, and also up and down. And this is really saying that the one that's on the outside that's not lined up is not a vineyard, it's not part of the vineyard, and it's just individual vines. And now our setbacks are going to matter, because this is going to be a case where, hey, look, it looks like you got a leniency. Isn't this great? Except that what happened is that this leniency is not really a leniency, because if you planted within 6 tefachim of the vines that didn't line up left and right with these other vines, then what happened? You planted within the 4 amos of your main vineyard, and you disqualified your vineyard. And that's a tragedy, because now you created a Kilayim issue and you have to rip up all your vines. It's a disaster. The case is going to go like this. You have 10 vines. It's organized in 2 rows, 5 and 5. And those are mirror images. And yes, if you take the string, it will go along each area perfectly, okay? Each one connects. It's in 2 rows. Can you get the tail in there? Yes, you can get the tail in there. That's a vineyard, okay? It's not Bet Shammai's vineyard of 5 vines by itself. It's 2 rows of 5, okay? Now, you have a 3rd row. The 3rd row is, let's say, 5 vines as well, and it's in a row. But these 5 vines are not lined up in a left-right pattern with the other 2 rows. Really, this set of 5 vines is planted, if you were to draw a line between the left-right side, this would be out of alignment. So we might have been thinking before that, we have these perfectly lined up vines going, say, north-south in sheer lines. But now what this Gemara is saying, wait a second. By the way, if you're going to have a vineyard, you also have to look to make sure that going the other direction, that it's lined up as well. That, this left-right side is also going to be lined up. And why is that? Well, it's going to say that really what this is this is a standalone vineyard on the outside. It's not lined up with the rest of the rows of vines. This is a standalone. So what do you have here? You have really Bet Shammai's 5-row vineyard, where this is just 5 rows by itself. And because it's not like Bet Hillel's vineyard where it's 2 and 3 and there's a tail, they were basically saying the halacha is that this 5-row vine by Bet Shammai is not a vineyard. And so now that it's not aligned with the other 2 sets of vines going, left and right, if you drew a string to connect the left and right sides of these other 10 vines, you would say that these are just 5 vines by themselves. And really, these 5 vines, like if you were to look up top of what's going on in the vineyard, these 5 vines are between the other rows, and they're not sheer and lined up together with the other rows. What's happening is you're going to end up where you're going to look and say that this last row is not part of the vineyard, and this last row doesn't qualify as a vineyard. It's just 5 vines by itself. And it's very nice that you could draw a string on, say, Bet Shammai's vineyard and connect all 5 vines in a row. You can't connect this last row with the other vines because it's out of alignment with the other vines. It's between the other vines. And so because it's out of alignment with these vines, you're saying that this vineyard here has setbacks of 4 tefachim because that's a vineyard. And what's going to be your vineyard? It's going to be 2 rows of 5. It's going to be 10 vines in total. And this one here is not a vineyard. It's just a collection of 5 vines. And the setbacks here are going to be 6 tefachim. And so you might say, but wait a second, maybe that's a good thing, right? Well, not so fast, because you could end up where maybe this 5-row vine is, line of vines in this 3rd row is going to be very, very close to the work area of the other vineyard. And so now, you can have it where, your 4 amma setback on, the 10 rows of vines is going to be within the distance of the 6 tefachim of this weird third row that's not really a vineyard, that it's like Bet Shammai's vineyard of 5 vines in a row, and it's out of alignment with the other 10 vines. Very clever what's happening here. What they're trying to do is they're trying to set up a case where they're saying, look, fine, you have your 5 vines, it's Bet Shammai's vineyard, so to speak, and you draw 6 tefachim. That's fine. But we know the vineyard over here, well, this is for 4 amos, and 4 amos is 4 times bigger than 6 tefachim. We've tried to plant foreign species within 6 tefachim of this Bet Shammai area of the vineyard that's out of alignment with the other 2 rows, but it's still within the 4 amos of the main vineyard. And now what do you do? So that's what we're going to get into now. So the Gemara is going to apply the law to a case where the 4 amma work area of the vineyard extends beyond the 6 tefachim of the outer row. And we're assuming that the unaligned row in the Baraisa is also going to be separated from the outermost row of 4 amos. So accordingly, somebody who's distancing himself 6 tefachim, which is going to be 1 amma, from the outer unaligned row can shortly plant the remainder of the foreign seed, and that's going to be distanced 6 tefachim from the outer row. But it's also going to be more than 4 amos from the outer set of your 10 vines. So what can happen is you can end up being allowed on your 5-row vine, but disqualified on your vineyard. So the Gemara is going to say that Rabbi Yossi says from this Baraisa that it emerges that if there is a row of foreign plants within the 6 tefach work area of the outer row, this row that turns out to be like Bet Shammai's vineyard, which is not counting as a vineyard, and it's also going to be within the 4 amma work area of the aligned rows of the 10 vines that do constitute a vineyard, because they're perfectly aligned, and also because they are, they're going to be more than the 2 and 3, but it's still going to have a tail in there. You could theoretically draw a tail there, and 2 rows of 5 vines that are perfectly aligned, both in the northwest way of drawing a string, and also in the east-west way of drawing a string, that's going to be a vineyard. So we're dealing with perfectly aligned rows, and then you have your outer row, and that is not aligned in the east-west way. In the northwest, in the north-south way of drawing a line, it's perfectly lined up like the other rows. It's just out of alignment with the rest of the vineyard, and this makes it forbidden. Now, the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, if, on the other hand, the plants were outside the 6 tefach work area of the outer row, in other words, Bet Shammai's vineyard there, but within the 4 amma work area of the aligned rows that constitute a vineyard, the vines of the outer row are permitted, and the vines of the vineyard is forbidden. So what is this trying to say? That the unaligned vines are not going to be rendered forbidden, since the foreign plants are not in the 6 tefach work area. But what did you render forbidden? You rendered forbidden the plants that are in the main part of the vineyard. So now you disqualified your vineyard. So, people say, well, okay, you can plant, foreign seed there, and isn't this nice? And it's a leniency. Very good. You're right. From, the Bet Shammai vineyard there, it is a leniency. You can plant within, just outside of the, 6 tefachim. You have your 6 tefach, work area and setback. Fine. But this 6 tefach, area is still within the 4 amma of the main vineyard. What did you do? You didn't disqualify these individual vines. You disqualified your vineyard. Your vineyard now is pasul. You can't use it. You can't use it. You made it forbidden. And so what did you do? Your yield collapses on your farm because you're saying, oh, well, I'm lenient over here. I'm going to get grapes from 5 vines. But you cut off grapes from 10 vines over here. You can't use them anymore. And so you can end up where you're saying, well, over here it's a leniency, I don't need to worry about it. But in the bigger picture, you ended up cutting off your yield. Now, there's other parts about, planting in a chaotic way. Well, you might be ending up where you have overlap of space for nutrition, and then your yield might collapse because of that as well. But this is a case that's a little bit different. This is a case where they're saying you're out of alignment Bet Shammai vines. That's going to be fine because you planted within just outside of the 6 tefachim work area for that. But within the 4 amma of your 10 vines, you disqualified your 10 vines. Congratulations. And so you have to be very careful because you might be disqualifying lots of different parts of your vineyard and ending up losing planted area. So the Mishnah is now going to say that a destroyed vineyard where there's going to be 10 vines to a betseya is going to be called a poor vineyard. And the Gemara is going to ask, what is a poor vineyard? Why is it referred to as a poor vineyard? And the Gemara is going to answer because it wants to know why is it using that terminology in the Mishnah? And Rabbi Yonah says it is called a poor vineyard because it is poor of vines and nevertheless rich in work area. In other words, you didn't utilize the space area. Your work area is very rich. It's underutilized. There's lots of walking area. There's lots of walking paths. But you didn't fully utilize your space for planting vines. And so it's called a poor vineyard because it's underutilized for space. And that's the idea. You want to have rational vineyards that are organized in rows so that you're fully utilizing it. You don't want, nice walking areas. This is not for you having like a nice walking garden. This is a production field. This is for you to get parnassah from. This is for you to get income. And how do you do that? You need to maximize your yield. You need to maximize your yield by doing setbacks correctly and not disqualifying plants. You also need to be doing it where you're fully planting the space where you're not overdoing it and taking away nutrition from other plants, but you're also fully utilizing your field. And that is why it's called a poor vineyard. You're not fully utilizing your space. It's rich in work area. You've overdone your work area and underutilized your space. So you're trying to get optimal fields here. And it's important because, if you're not getting optimal fields, you're not growing as much product. And that is the takeaway for this. And that's why it needed its own shear, because a lot of people get confused from that. A lot of people think that, oh, this is great. I get these leniencies over here. And, this example is trying to show you that, very good. You've ended up cutting off, part of your usable vines by, taking this leniency here on, in this case, the Bet Shammai part of the vineyard that's not a vineyard, counting them as individual vines and planting there. But within a big enough area now that you've lost, the setback over here, and it's close enough to the main part of the vineyard that you've disqualified that. You didn't disqualify your 5 vines, you disqualified the bigger part of your field. And so this is a thing in the geometry where you have to be very careful about your setbacks, especially if you have these quote-unquote leniencies here, because you might be within the 4 amma area of your main area and disqualifying your field. And that's something that really is not good for parnassah. Have a great day.